The town, nestled deep in the folds of northern Maine, Elijah Woods always knew was a place time had simply forgotten. Time did not forget it intentionally. Rather, it lay discarded like an old, well-worn sweater, laid aside and eventually overlooked in a dusty attic. He was 28, a librarian by trade, a quiet man living a quiet life that was, in truth, an echo of the town itself. The silence here was not the empty kind, but a rich, heavy quiet, thick with pine and damp earth, punctuated only by the distant caw of a crow or the murmur of the river that snaked through the valley. Beyond the last scattering of houses, the forest began. An ancient, brooding presence that locals simply called the Old Whispering Woods. They were always shrouded in a low-hanging mist, their towering spruces and ancient birches a wall of impenetrable green that guarded untold secrets. 6 months had passed since his father, Jacob Woods, had died. 6 months of Elijah walking through the familiar rooms of the old farmhouse. He felt the ghost of his father in the worn armchair, smelled the pipe tobacco that still clung to the curtains, and recognized the faint metallic tang of his workshop down in the cellar. He put off dealing with that cellar, Jacob's sacred domain, for as long as he could. It was a small, windowless space, accessible only by a set of steep, creaking wooden stairs behind the kitchen pantry. His father had rarely let anyone down there, and Elijah, even as a boy, had respected that unspoken boundary. Now, procrastination became a confrontation with a memory he was not ready to face, a lingering sense of incompletion that hummed beneath the surface of his otherwise orderly life. It was a gray, spitting autumn day. The rain fell without real conviction, just enough to slick the asphalt and deepen the color of the forest leaves to a somber, bruised purple. Elijah had finally braced himself. He descended the narrow steps, pushing aside the heavy canvas curtain that had always served as the cellar door. The air down there was thick, still, smelling of damp earth, old sawdust, and something else. A faint, imperceptible scent of gunpowder and dried leaves, a smell that had always been uniquely his father's. The single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling cast a stark, yellow light, making the shadows dance like ghoulish specters in the corners. The shelves were heavy with dusty jars of screws, rusted tools, paint cans, and fishing tackle. But as Elijah began to sort, to touch the objects his father had touched, he found things that jolted him, pulling him out of the comfortable melancholy of memory. Tucked away behind a stack of weathered lumber, he discovered an array of weapons that made his breath catch in his throat. There were antique rifles, their wooden stocks intricately engraved with swirling patterns of Celtic design, the barrels gleaming dully. Kitted next to them were blades of unusual design, long curved knives, too heavy, too brutal for mere hunting, their edges honed to a razor sharpness. He found small leaden bags filled with silver bullets, each meticulously shaped, some even etched with tiny, invisible symbols. There were quivers, not for sport arrows, but for thick, heavy shafts tipped with obsidian, also bearing those strange, unsettling markings. And then, at the very back, under a grimy tarp, lay a series of homemade traps. They were immense, fashioned from thick steel, with jaws capable of snapping a bear's leg clean off. These were not the kind of traps a man used for raccoons or squirrels. These were designed for something truly monstrously large. This arsenal, this collection of instruments of death, was a stark, horrifying contradiction to the image Elijah held of his father. a quiet, contemplative woodsman, a lover of nature, a man who spoke to the trees as old friends. Jacob Woods had been a man who found solace in the deep, green embrace of the forest, not one who prepared for a war within its shadowy depths. His hands, already trembling from the unsettling discovery, brushed against something hard and leathery beneath an old, scratched workbench. He pulled away the canvas cover, and there it was, a journal. It was old, its leather cover deeply worn, the corners dog-eared and frayed. An earthy, musty smell rose from it, mingled with the familiar scent of old paper and something else, something sharp and acrid, metallic, the unmistakable, sickening aroma of dried blood. On the cover, the letters, though faded and consumed by time, were still chillingly clear, burned into the leather as with a branding iron: "Do not read. If you found this, I am gone, and they are coming for you." Elijah's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. An irrational, primal fear coiled in his gut, a cold dread, ancient and profound. Yet beneath the icy grip of terror, a potent curiosity flared, stoked by the sudden, terrifying mystery that now enveloped his father's life. The warning, stark and absolute, initially struck him as absurd, but then sent a shiver of profound seriousness through him. It was not a joke. It was a desperate, final plea. The forbidden fruit, the forbidden knowledge, was too potent to resist. With clumsy, alien hands, Elijah opened the journal. The first entries were dated decades ago, written in his father's familiar, steady hand. They were terse, scientific field observations, meticulous descriptions of tracks, the habits of large predators, diagrams of brutal, complex traps, notes on the phases of the moon and the cycles of beast activity. His father's language was detached, military in its precision and lack of emotion, yet scrupulously detailed. They were the notes of a seasoned trapper, a game warden, someone obsessed with the wilderness. But as Elijah delved deeper, the comfortable facade, though unsettling, began to crack. The prose, still dispassionately observational, introduced details that defied the natural world, concepts that curdled his blood. Mentions of human-like paws that left prints too large for any known animal. Incredible strength that tore through solid timber. Acts of calculated aggression that superseded mere instinct. Conscious gazes that held an unnerving intelligence. And eyes filled with ancient wisdom that saw far more than a beast ever could. It became horrifyingly clear. His father was not writing about wolves. He was not describing bears. He was detailing something far more terrifying, something that clawed at the edges of human comprehension, a nightmare given flesh and fang. The silence of the cellar, once a comforting envelope, now pressed in on him, filled with the unspoken horrors of the old whispering woods. The night swallowed Elijah whole, the words of the journal echoing in his mind like a broken bell. He had stumbled from the cellar, the heavy leather-bound book clutched in his numb hands, and found himself adrift in his own living room. Sleep was a distant, mocking whisper, an impossibility in the face of the truths he had unearthed. He sat slumped in his father's old armchair, the scent of stale pipe smoke doing little to anchor him. Every shadow in the corners twisted, every creak of the old farmhouse, usually a comforting lullaby, now sounded as a whisper of unseen things. The initial disbelief, the rational skepticism that had been his shield for so long, had disintegrated, replaced by a cold, sticky panic that clung to his skin. Each word his father had painstakingly penned now felt soaked in unseen blood, in the primal, bone-deep fear of a man who had faced the unimaginable, imbued with a terrible, ancient knowledge that had, until now, been hidden from the world. Elijah began to see everything differently, through the chilling prism of these shocking revelations. The familiar world had receded, leaving behind a landscape of lurking horror. The journal unveiled a profound, terrifying methodicalness in Jacob. He had not been a woodsman. He had been a guard, a sentinel. His life had been a meticulous, years-long covert operation, a relentless surveillance of what he called the packs. He detailed their migration routes through the very forests that ringed their quiet town, their seasonal shelters deep within the tangled wilderness, their lairs in forgotten caves, and their territorial markers. Gruesome carvings on ancient trees that Elijah suddenly felt a sickening urge to go searching for. This was not just hunting, a sport, or even pest control. This was a full-scale, deeply personal, decades-long war, fought in the deep, echoing silence of the woods, a war his father had waged alone. What truly sent a shiver down Elijah's spine were the entries describing the creature's startling intelligence. "They are smarter than they seem," his father had written in a scrawling, agitated hand. "They wait. Sometimes they look directly into your eyes and do not attack, as testing you, seeing you remember the rules of their game. These are not merely animals. These are ancient predators, and they have their own customs, their own sacrifices, their own rituals." Elijah felt a cold dread bloom in his chest. These rules, he realized with a sickening lurch, did not just apply to his father. They applied to anyone who dared to intrude upon their territory, anyone who stumbled across their existence. Now, that included him. As he flipped through the worn pages, a particular date scratched into the margin leaped out at him. It coincided precisely with a night from his own childhood. He remembered it vividly, a restless night spent huddled beneath his thick flannel blanket, listening to strange rustlings outside his window, a sickening scratch-scrape sound against the wood of the house, and then a long, drawn-out, utterly inhuman wail that tore the very fabric of the night. He had been a small boy, 7 or 8, and the primal terror had been so profound that he buried his head under the covers, convinced it was some monster from a storybook. He never mentioned it to his father, nor his mother, who was still alive then. He simply dismissed it as a nightmare, a child's overactive imagination. Now he began to recall the inexplicable anxiety he often felt on those nights when his father would slip out of the house after dark, the faint creak of the back door barely audible, leaving Elijah with a hollow ache of unease he could not name. And then, his father's returns. Always at dawn, just as the first hesitant light began to pierce the eastern sky. Elijah, a curious boy, sometimes caught a glimpse. His father, usually so neat and contained, would be a mess. Muddy boots tracking forest loam across the kitchen linoleum, clothes soaked through, smelling not just of pine and damp earth, but of wood smoke, sweat, and something else. Something sharp and metallic, like blood, a scent Elijah had always attributed to hunting. But it was his father's eyes that now haunted him most. Jacob Wood's eyes, usually a warm, steady hazel, would be distant, clouded, empty. A gaze that had seen something unspeakable, something beyond the capacity of words. Elijah then simply thought his father was tired from heavy work in the woods, a phrase Jacob uttered with a dismissive wave of his hand whenever his wife asked about his late-night excursions. Now, those empty eyes, that distant gaze, acquired a chilling, new, and utterly terrifying meaning. Elijah tried desperately to rationalize it away. He clung to the idea that his father had suffered from a progressive mental illness, a slow decline into delusion. He told himself these were merely elaborate metaphors for very real, savage, wild animals, a coping mechanism for life in the deep woods. He even forced himself to believe it was a profound, elaborate fantasy, an escape from personal tragedy or deep-seated trauma. But the discomfort within him, the cold, gnawing certainty of impending disaster, refused to be silenced. It vibrated deep in his bones, a disharmonious hum that slowly, inexorably, drove him mad. That evening, as the rain turned to a miserable drizzle, Elijah tried to distract himself from the journal. He put on the local radio, a small, crackly affair on the kitchen counter, hoping for some mundane news, a connection back to the normal world. Instead, his attention was seized by a report, delivered by the local disc jockey in a strangely subdued, hushed tone. Farmer Horton, from the neighboring outskirts, had reported mysterious attacks on his livestock. Sheep, the report stated, had been torn to shreds, some with unnatural wounds indicating an assailant far more ferocious than any bear, an assailant savagely, brutally violent. The disc jockey, usually jovial, sounded genuinely rattled, and for the first time in Elijah's memory, a genuine, unsettling wave of apprehension began to ripple through the quiet town. Whispers, long dormant, began to creep out from behind closed doors, murmuring of something very bad in the woods. And Elijah, clutching the blood-scented journal, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach, knowing with absolute certainty that he now held the key to understanding exactly what that something was. The radio report about Farmer Horton's livestock was not just news. It was a contagion. In the days that followed, Elijah, keenly attuned now to the subtle shifts in the town's atmosphere, watched as an invisible epidemic of fear began to spread. The local residents, usually a mix of easygoing, chatty folks who loved to gossip over coffee at the diner, became withdrawn, their faces tighter, their gazes more suspicious. The children, who usually played until dusk, their laughter echoing down the streets, were now called inside before the sun even began its slow descent. At the general store, the usual banter about crops and weather was replaced by hushed conversations about strange, inexplicable occurrences that in earlier times were casually dismissed as wild animal antics or teenage hooliganism. Now, no one found the easy explanations, and the silence that followed those discussions was heavier than usual. Elijah found himself drawn back to his father's journal, its leather cover feeling impossibly warm in his hands despite the chill he felt deep inside. The subsequent entries, written in Jacob's meticulous hand, detailed the horrifying specifics of the attacks. These creatures, he wrote, did not simply kill for sustenance. They often played with their victims, leaving behind cruelly mutilated corpses, sometimes even marking their territories with grotesque displays. His father had observed an unusual cruelty and ritualism that unmistakably set them apart from common predators. Elijah's blood ran cold. He flipped back to the radio report, the description of the wounds on Horton's sheep. The gruesome details matched his father's accounts with an unnerving, horrifying precision. Torn flesh, broken bones twisted at unnatural angles, The sheer overkill brutality. It was all there, a sickening blueprint of terror. Just a few days later, the local rag, the weekly Maple Creek Gazette, the name of the publication, not the town, arrived in the library. Its headline, usually a dull report on local zoning or school board meetings, screamed in stark, bold print, "Dogs missing, deer mutilated near forest edge." Elijah unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. The article reported the disappearance of several domestic dogs from homes on the outskirts, followed by the gruesome discovery of a deer carcass, so savaged and dismembered that even the most seasoned hunters could not attribute it to a bear or a pack of wolves. The description was chilling. Ragged wounds, not characteristic of bear claws or wolf teeth, and tracks of enormous paws, eerily similar to human hands. He felt a cold sweat prickle his skin. It was happening, all of it, just as his father had described. Then came the night. Elijah, woken abruptly from a nightmare where he was running through an endless misty forest, heard it. A sound that pierced the deep, oppressive silence of the night, slicing through the heavy curtains of sleep and sanity. A long, drawn-out, utterly inhuman howl. It was not the lonely lament of a wolf, nor the yapping bark of a coyote, nor the guttural roar of a bear. This was a sound that came from the very gut of the earth, from a place of ancient hunger and despair, reverberating from the deepest depths of the old whispering woods. It swept over the hushed houses of the town, seeping through the walls, through the very bones of the structures, raising goosebumps on his arms. This was it. The same terrifying sound he had heard as a child, dismissed as a figment of a feverish imagination. Now, with a clarity that stung like frostbite, he understood. It had never been a fantasy. It had always been real. The journal lay open on his bedside table, its pages now less a source of information and more a grim prophecy. His father's meticulous notes on lunar cycles filled several pages, with detailed observations on the phases of the full moon and the periods of maximum activity these creatures exhibited during those nights. Elijah snatched his calendar, his heart hammering against his ribs. The current incidents, the disappearances, the attacks, the chilling howl, they were all occurring precisely in the days leading up to the full moon, which was a week away. He felt the very fabric of the reality he knew, the comfortable, predictable world of books and quiet routines, tearing apart at the seams, dissolving into a nightmare he no longer denied. His fear, once a distant tremor, escalated into a suffocating paranoia. Every shadow in the corners of his vision shifted, stretched, coalesced into something monstrous. He began to hear phantom rustlings outside his windows. To his hyper-alert ears, they were the stealthy movements of something large and predatory. Every innocuous creak of the old house, every branch tapping against the glass, sent a jolt of panic through him. The image of his father, a solitary figure locked in a secret, brutal war in the heart of the wilderness, haunted him, becoming a relentless, tormenting vision. He felt trapped, caught in a net woven of his father's terrible secret, a secret that had claimed Jacob's life, and now threatened to claim his own sanity. A desperate need for answers, for any shred of corroboration, drove Elijah to begin his own clandestine investigation. During his lunch breaks at the library, he combed through dusty newspaper archives, poring over microfiche, searching for old, forgotten incidents, anything that aligned with his father's chilling narratives. He cautiously broached the subject with the town's older residents, the ones who had lived here their entire lives, attempting to coax out old legends, local folklore about forest monsters and things in the dark. But he met only with frightened, evasive glances, their eyes wide with unspoken anxieties, and an outright, stubborn refusal to speak of anything supernatural. Their silence, their fear, spoke volumes. It was not a denial born of disbelief, but a denial born of a deeply ingrained, generations-old terror. And in their fearful reticence, Elijah found not comfort, but a terrifying confirmation of the truth. Among the blood-stained, dog-eared pages of his father's journal, Elijah found it. A brittle, yellowed piece of parchment, painstakingly hand-drawn. It was a map, crude but detailed, of the town and the vast, encompassing sprawl of the old, whispering woods. His father had marked it with a grim precision that chilled Elijah to the bone. Red ink denoted sites of violent attacks, X's blooming like dried bloodstains across the verdant landscape. Green lines, like faint serpentine veins, traced the creatures' retreat paths, their hidden roots back into the impenetrable depths. And in stark, unsettling black, circled with a thick, ominous hand, were locations marked nests and lairs, deep within the most desolate, untrod parts of the forest. What sent a fresh wave of ice through Elijah's veins was the chilling realization that some of the red marks, the sites of older attacks, aligned perfectly with the current string of gruesome incidents. The horror was not just repeating itself. It was following a pattern, a territorial claim laid down generations ago, now being vigorously reasserted. Under the increasing weight of dread and a desperate, gnawing need to verify the impossible, Elijah decided he had to see for himself. He drove his old pickup truck out to Farmer Horton's place, the gravel crunching under his tires. He introduced himself as a biology student from a state university, feigning an academic interest in unusual wild animal predation patterns. Horton, a man usually ruddy and boisterous, was a shadow of his former self, his face pale and etched with exhaustion and terror. He led Elijah to the mangled remains of his sheep pens, pointing to oak fence posts, thick as a man's thigh, splintered and torn as by an explosion. "Not a bear," Horton whispered, his voice hoarse. "No bear could have done that. Not with that kind of strength." On the damp, churned earth around the demolished pens, Elijah found them. Tracks. They were unlike anything he had ever seen in the woods. Too large, too splayed for a wolf, certainly. Too deep, too defined for even the largest grizzly bear. The imprint of the claws was unsettlingly distinct, not the rounded, blunt nails of a bear, but long, finger-like digits tipped with sharp-pointed talons, leaving a mark that was disturbingly similar to a monstrous, distorted human hand. Elijah, his own hands trembling, fumbled for his phone, snapping several grainy pictures. Later, back in the dim light of his cellar, he compared them to the crude, haunting sketches in his father's journal. The resemblance was sickening. Perfect. The nightmare, he realized, was not just alive. It was clawing at his doorstep, shedding blood and leaving its terrifying signature in the mud of the real world. His father's journal had contained several pages dedicated solely to their gaze. Jacob had described it as hypnotizing, intelligent, capable of instilling profound terror and paralyzing the will. He spoke of feeling pinioned, exposed, as his very soul was laid bare by those ancient burning eyes. Now, Elijah felt it too. the insidious sensation of being watched, a prickling awareness at the back of his neck. Even within the supposed sanctuary of his own home, every subtle creak of the old floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, every sudden shadow thrown by the setting sun made him jump, his heart thumping erratically. The feeling was pervasive, a cold, clinical observation, as his every move was catalogued, analyzed, by something unseen, yet utterly present. Driven by a desperate need for understanding, Elijah immersed himself in the town's archived history. He began to connect old, half-forgotten incidents. Local lore chalked these up to misfortune or the unpredictable wildness of nature, to his father's meticulously recorded zones of activity on the map. There were the inexplicable disappearances. A couple of hikers who had ventured too deep into the Whispering Woods decades ago and simply vanished. A local drifter, a harmless old man named Silas, who had camped near the old logging trails and was never seen again. He found reports of rabies outbreaks among the deer population that were unusually virulent and widespread, always near the marked nests. And then, the unexplained fires. Several instances of small, contained forest blazes, occurring mysteriously close to the areas his father had circled in black ink. All of it, once disparate pieces of a forgotten past, now clicked into place, forming a horrifying yet undeniably logical mosaic of terror. The relentless reading of the journal, coupled with his own chilling observations, began to pull Elijah into a maelstrom of paranoia. He found himself questioning his own sanity. On one hand, the journal, with its tales of ancient shapeshifters, was the product of a fevered, delusional mind. On the other, the real-world events, the mutilated livestock, the impossible tracks, the unseen eyes, perfectly validated every terrifying word. He felt the edges of his own control fraying, a terrifying premonition that he too was losing his grip, just as his father had, waging his lonely, desperate war against an unspeakable horror. One afternoon, in the quiet hum of the library, the old woman O'Malley, a frail woman with eyes like faded china, approached Elijah. She had known his father for 60 years, since they were children. Her voice was barely a whisper, her eyes wide with a deep, unsettling anxiety that mirrored his own. "Your father, Jacob," she began, her gnarled hand clutching his arm. "He always knew there was something not right in the woods. He knew too much, Elijah. He was obsessed with it. You be careful, boy. Sometimes it's better not to dig up what should stay buried, or it'll crawl right out." Her words, delivered with such a profound, genuine fear, were not a warning he dismissed. They were instead a chilling confirmation, bolstering his growing, terrifying certainty in the truth of the journal. The line between sanity and madness blurred even further, and Elijah knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that he was already on the wrong side of it. The entries in his father's journal, as Elijah pushed deeper into the fraying pages, grew increasingly fraught, more frantic. Jacob Woods described moments when the creatures, these shifting horrors, approached his makeshift shelters deep in the old Whispering Woods, sometimes to within an arm's length. They stalked him, observed him, played with him, as Jacob described it, testing his resolve, his nerve, his very sanity. And then, deliberately, inexplicably, they retreated, never attacking. "They want you to know," his father had scrawled in a particularly agitated entry, "that you are on their territory, that you are helpless. They do not want to merely kill. They enjoy the fear, Elijah. They savor it. This was not merely a record of encounters. It was a chronicle of psychological torment, a cat-and-mouse game played with a predator far more intelligent and cruel than any animal. Elijah found himself succumbing to this very torment. He began to feel a constant oppressive presence, a chilling certainty that he was no longer alone. His old farmhouse, a place he had always considered a sanctuary, a bulwark against the world, now felt subtly, terrifyingly changed. Floorboards, which had always creaked in familiar patterns, now groaned at inexplicable times when no one was moving. Books, which he had meticulously organized on his shelves, were sometimes found slightly askew or on the floor. A faint, icy draft snaked through the rooms, even with all the windows tightly shut against the autumn chill, carrying a faint, unsettling scent of wet earth and something musky, feral. These were not grand, dramatic events, but 1,000 tiny, imperceptible details, each one a whisper of violation, a chilling intimation that his space had been breached, that someone had been here, silently watching while he was away, or while he was asleep. The journal also held the grim, invaluable knowledge of how to fight back. His father had painstakingly documented methods for hunting these things, their vulnerable points. Silver, not just any silver, but specially purified and consecrated metal, shaped into bullets and blade tips. Aconite, known as wolfsbane, a potent poison, prepared in specific ways. Certain rituals and symbols, ancient and arcane, that deterred or repelled them, at least temporarily. With a surge of desperate hope, Elijah began to scour his father's workshop, the same cellar where he had found the journal. He found secret compartments behind loose bricks in the fireplace hearth, under the workbench, even behind a false back in an old filing cabinet. Inside, tucked away in carefully labeled jars and pouches, were vials filled with shimmering powders, small bottles of viscous dark liquids, strange dried herbs that smelled faintly of earth and sulfur, and an assortment of crudely fashioned amulets carved from bone and wood, each etched with the same unsettling symbols he had seen on the silver bullets and obsidian arrowheads. It was all real, all horrifyingly, terrifyingly real. Then came the night of the true encounter. Elijah, stretched out on his living room couch, the journal resting on his chest, drifted into a fitful, shallow sleep. He awoke with a gasp, a cold dread clinging to him. He did not know what had startled him, but his body was rigid, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The house was utterly silent, save for the whisper of the wind against the eaves. He squinted into the inky blackness beyond his bedroom window, and then he saw it. A faint, imperceptible scratching sound, soft at first, then growing more insistent, coming from directly outside his bedroom window. He froze, every muscle in his body locked in place. Through the thin pane of glass, a dark, enormous silhouette briefly flickered, too large, too quick for any animal known to these woods. It was impossibly fast, a blur of motion, but he saw enough. He saw two luminous, predatory points of light, gleaming like malevolent coals, fixed directly on him. Eyes. They were watching him, unwavering, devoid of any animal instinct, filled with an ancient, terrifying intelligence. He gasped, a dry, choked sound, his breath catching in his throat, and the world tilted on its axis. This was no dream, no hallucination. This was solid, terrifying reality, standing just beyond the glass, waiting. Elijah spent the remainder of that endless night pressed against the wall, the cold steel of his father's shotgun a terrifyingly familiar weight in his hands. He felt like a cornered animal, his mind ricocheting wildly between a desperate denial of the impossible and a complete, terrifying acceptance of the horror. His father had not been mad. He had been a hero, a solitary sentinel fighting an unimaginable evil that had now turned its hungry gaze upon his son. In the throes of his terror, memories, long dormant and dismissed as irrelevant, began to surface. He remembered his father, patiently teaching him how to clean a rifle, how to hold it steady, how to shoot with precision. He recalled lessons in tracking animals through the deepest parts of the woods, how to read the subtle signs of broken twigs or disturbed leaves, how to distinguish between a deer's print and a bear's. Jacob had taught him how to survive in the wilderness, how to build a fire in the rain, how to navigate by the stars. At the time, Elijah had simply considered it part of his father's strange upbringing, the eccentric hobbies of a reclusive woodsman. Now, with the weight of the shotgun in his hands and the lingering chill of those predatory eyes on his memory, he understood. These were not hobbies. This had been a brutal, lifelong preparation for a battle he never knew he would inherit, a war he was now inescapably a part of, armed only with the fragments of his father's grim knowledge and the cold, hard steel of a weapon designed for monsters. A potent mix of emotions churned within him. Beneath the suffocating fear, there was a furious, righteous anger. Anger at his father for having concealed such a monstrous truth from him, for having allowed him to live in blissful ignorance while this ancient war raged just beyond the tree line. And anger at himself for his own naive acceptance of the comfortable lies, for his blindness. Yet beneath that anger, a new feeling began to bloom, one of profound, aching respect for Jacob Woods, a man who had lived for years in the lengthening shadow of an invisible war, protecting his town, his family, without ever being acknowledged, without ever seeking thanks. He had been a silent guardian, a lonely warrior, and now that terrible legacy was Elijah's to bear. The journal's final pages were a descent into a palpable, gut-wrenching despair. His father's once steady hand had grown erratic, the lines wavering, the ink often smudged as by a trembling thumb. Grim predictions appeared more frequently, stark declarations scrawled across the paper like desperate warnings. Jacob wrote of their activity intensifying, becoming bolder, shedding the last vestiges of their animal cunning for an overt, chilling aggression. He felt the ring tightening, a suffocating encirclement that left him little room to breathe, let alone fight. He clearly understood that his time was running out, that they were drawing too close, too many, too relentless to be held back for much longer. The town, already gripped by a low hum of unease, found itself plunged into new, more aggressive incidents that ripped through the fragile fabric of its peace. Old Man Hemlock, the grizzled forest ranger who regularly checked the old logging traps deep in the whispering woods, simply vanished. His truck was found abandoned by the trailhead, its engine still warm, a half-eaten sandwich on the dashboard. Not a trace of him was ever found. Then, just 2 nights later, the local sheriff, a stoic man named Mr. Miller, stepped onto his porch to retrieve his morning paper and found his prize, German Shepherd Buster, lying on his welcome mat. The dog was not just dead, it was horrifically mutilated, its body a testament to a savage, overwhelming force, its head twisted at an unnatural angle. This was no random attack. This was a deliberate, open threat, a monstrous calling card left with chilling precision. A clear demonstration of power that transcended mere animalistic predation. In his final entries, Jacob described his desperate, futile attempts to cover his tracks, to distract their attention from the town and, more specifically, from himself. But each time he realized the heartbreaking futility of it. He understood with a terrible, growing clarity that they were not just seeking a random victim. They were looking for him, Jacob Woods, personally. They wanted his knowledge, his secrets, and, as he wrote, perhaps something else, something he possessed that they coveted. The entries revealed a deeper connection, a relentless, focused pursuit that was chillingly intelligent. Elijah saw the physical toll the war had taken on his father. The handwriting in the last few pages was illegible, a frantic, desperate scrawl, uneven and shaky, a testament to Jacob's profound physical and emotional exhaustion. The brittle, yellowed pages were frequently marred by dark, rusty brown stains that were dried blood, mixed with the dark, viscous mud of the forest floor. He felt the pain, the profound despair, radiating from the tattered pages, a silent scream etched into the very fibers of the paper. And then, his father described a last trap, a final, desperate gambit he had set, not for victory, but merely to delay them, to buy precious moments, to win time. "I hope this gives you time, son, if you ever read this," Jacob had scrawled, the words tearing through the paper. Elijah's breath caught in his throat, a cold spike of realization piercing him. He understood now. His father had sacrificed himself. He had engineered his own end, a brutal, final stand to create a diversion, to buy time, to give his adopted son a chance to survive, a chance to escape. The full weight of his father's love, mixed with his terrible, tragic purpose, crashed down on Elijah with the force of a tidal wave. His hand trembled uncontrollably as he turned the last heavy page. And there it was, the culminating entry, written in large, jagged, clawed letters, as gouged into the paper itself. "Today I will not return. They found a way. They broke through. If you read this, know, I did everything to stop them. I fought to the end. But now their attention will be on you. You are my last bastion. Be ready." With the final chilling words of the journal, a profound, paralyzing cold seeped into Elijah's bones, a glacial grip that spread through his limbs, numbing him. He knew his father, in his dying breath, had not only bequeathed him his terrible knowledge and his arsenal, but had also transferred his curse, a dark, prophetic burden. Jacob had foreseen this moment, the exact instant his son would open this accursed book and take on his impossible, deadly mantle. There was no more pretense, no more room for doubt or rationalization. This was not a fantasy, not a product of a sick imagination. This was stark, brutal reality, and Elijah Woods was now irrevocably caught in its terrifying maw. The last words of the journal hung in the air, a chilling echo in the suffocating silence of Elijah's house. It was a silence so profound, so absolute, that it absorbed all other sound, leaving behind only the frantic hammering of his own heart. Every tree visible through the window, every gnarled branch and whispering leaf of the old whispering woods, now concealed a malevolent ancient secret, watching him. He felt impossibly vulnerable, as his entire life was a flimsy facade, a stage curtain behind which an unimaginable horror had always lurked, waiting for its cue. He tried desperately to quiet the racing thoughts, to convince himself that it was merely the power of suggestion, that his overactive mind was playing cruel tricks. But the cold knot in his stomach, the sticky primal fear that clung to his skin like grave dust, refused to loosen its grip. He found his gaze involuntarily drawn to the windows, to the edges of the room, feeling an unseen yet undeniably piercing gaze fixed upon him. It was a sensation that crawled up his spine, a silent surveillance that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. That very night, unable to shake the journal's hold, unable to rest, Elijah sought a futile distraction, walking the deserted, rain-slicked streets of the town. The streetlights, usually a comforting glow, dimmed and flickered, casting unusually long, sinuous shadows that danced with unsettling life. The air grew heavy, thick with the sharp scent of pine needles, the rich, decaying smell of damp earth, and something else, something primal, musky, a scent that reminded him of raw, wet fur, clinging to the air like a shroud. As he turned the corner onto his own darkened street, he noticed them. At the very edge of the forest, where the dense curtain of trees met the scant, yellow light of the distant street lamp, he saw them. 2 pairs of eyes. They glowed, a dull, predatory amber in the inky blackness, like embers burning deep within the night. They did not move. They simply watched him, utterly still, utterly silent, 2 sets of malevolent orbs fixed on his retreating figure. They made no attempt to hide, no stealthy retreat into the deeper shadows. Instead, their silent vigil was a deliberate declaration, a chilling message delivered without a single sound. He was seen. He was known. He had been marked. And with a terrifying certainty, Elijah understood. He was their next target. An invisible but utterly tangible thread of connection stretched between Elijah and those burning eyes, a cold electric current of understanding. These were not merely animals reacting to a presence. In their unblinking gaze there was a challenge, a chilling warning, and an ancient, insatiable hunger that spoke of something far beyond the realm of instinct. They were waiting, he realized, for him to fully awaken, for him to consciously, inescapably, take up the terrible legacy of his father. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over Elijah. He broke into a stumbling run, fumbling with his keys as he burst through his front door, slamming it shut and frantically throwing every lock, every bolt into place. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm, and the blood pounded in his ears, a deafening roar. He leaned against the door, trying to control his ragged breathing, but the adrenaline surged through him, an icy, burning current that drowned out all attempts at calm. He understood, with a clarity that stung like a fresh wound. The hunt had begun. He was no longer a mere spectator, no longer a horrified reader of a dead man's diary. He had become the quarry, the target. In that moment, an overwhelming, suffocating loneliness descended upon Elijah. His father, the only one who had known this unspeakable truth, was dead. And he, Elijah, was now the sole inheritor of that knowledge, a truth that had become his chilling, inescapable curse. Despair, cold and heavy as a stone, mingled with a nascent, desperate resolve. He had to do something. He had to act. Otherwise, he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his very soul, he would undoubtedly share his father's gruesome, solitary fate. The silence pressed in, but now it was not merely quiet. It was watching, waiting. And Elijah, alone in his locked house, knew he was no longer safe. Elijah stood in the center of his living room, the old journal still clutched in his trembling hands. The events of the night, the glowing eyes, the palpable sense of being watched, the undeniable invitation to a game he had not chosen, had shattered any remaining pretense of normalcy. He reread the last few entries, his eyes scanning for answers, for any forgotten clue, any fragment of wisdom his father had left behind. Fear, a cold, bitter taste in his mouth, was now inextricably mixed with a furious, desperate resolve, yet also a profound, aching sense of hopelessness. He felt adrift on an ocean of the unknown, with only this blood-stained book as his compass. Between the worn, age-yellowed leaves of the journal, tucked deep within a cleverly concealed pocket on the inside cover, a pocket so seamless it was invisible, he discovered it. A carefully folded, unassuming envelope. It was not sealed, but its precise placement and the subtle way it blended with the aging leather meant it had been deliberately hidden, designed to go unnoticed by any casual glance. He lifted it to his nose. It smelled of old paper, of course, but also something else, something subtly bitter, a scent that reminded him of crushed herbs and forgotten, sorrowful memories. With a deep, shaky breath, Elijah opened the envelope. Inside lay a single faded photograph, its edges softened by time and wear. It was decades old, the kind taken with a simple box camera. In the center, there was his father, Jacob Woods, younger then. His face serious but softened by a rare, warm smile. He stood with his hand resting gently on the shoulder of a small boy. The boy was smiling too, a bright, innocent smile, his eyes sparkling with a vibrant, youthful energy. But it was not Elijah. He did not recognize this child. And as he stared, a sickening realization bloomed in his gut. There was something in the boy's eyes, even in that faded image, something unsettling, an intensity that was oddly mature, predatory, entirely out of place in a child so young. A wave of profound unease washed over Elijah. He turned the photograph over, his fingers suddenly clumsy. On the back, written in his father's hand, a script that was usually firm and steady but now appeared painfully uneven, carved into the paper with desperate force, were words that instantly froze the blood in his veins. My real son. Real blood. He is already one of them. I could not save him. Forgive me, Elijah. The world, already teetering on the brink of chaos, plunged into a dizzying abyss. Elijah felt the floor drop out from under him. He was adopted. All his memories of family, of childhood, of his very identity, they were not lies, not exactly, but an intricately woven tapestry of artful omissions, a carefully constructed illusion. His father had not simply hidden the existence of these monsters, these horrors in the woods. He had concealed the most devastating truth of all. His own blood, his biological son, the boy in the photograph, had become one of them. A monster. A million questions, each one a fresh stab of pain, began to swirl in Elijah's reeling mind. Who were his actual parents? Where was this boy now? His blood brother, the thing in the woods? Why had his father, knowing the terrible fate of his own son, taken in an adopted child, raised him, loved him, when his true blood walked the night as a beast? He grappled with the question. Was it an act of profound guilt? A desperate attempt to atone for a sin he could not name? A more insidious, horrifying thought surfaced. Was it a cynical, calculated move? A decoy? Was Elijah merely a false trail, a living shield, meant to divert the attention of the pack, to make them believe he was the sole heir of the hunter, thereby protecting his monstrous biological son? The thought was vile, repulsive, but it clung to him, adding a bitter, burning edge to his burgeoning grief and fear. The horrifying realization that somewhere in those ancient, whispering woods incredibly close lived his own blood brother, transformed into a ravening beast, drove Elijah into a state of profound, numbing shock. This was no longer an abstract monster, a terrifying antagonist from his father's journal. This was family. This was his own blood, twisted into something unspeakable. The horror became achingly personal, intimately grotesque, weaving itself into the very fabric of his being. He felt utterly torn, his heart a ragged wound. The old whispering woods, once a source of quiet wonder, then of creeping terror, now held a secret so intimately horrifying, so deeply intertwined with his own existence, that he knew he would never truly be free of its grasp. He was bound, by blood and by fate, to the nightmare. The night stretched out, long and suffocating, as Elijah grappled with the monstrous revelation. His world had not merely shifted, it had imploded. His entire identity, his fundamental understanding of himself, his place in the world, his very past, all of it lay in shattered fragments around him. He felt utterly deceived, lost in a labyrinth of lies, and devastatingly alone, adrift in a sea of unspoken truths. The comfortable narrative of his life, so carefully constructed, had disintegrated into a chilling, unfamiliar horror story. Now, all the subtle strangeness in his father's behavior, the moments of distant preoccupation, the sometimes melancholic and profoundly sad look in his eyes, a look Elijah had always attributed to the hard life of a solitary woodsman, burdened by the silent weight of the forest, all of it now acquired a new, deeply tragic and terrifying meaning. His father had not been merely a quiet man. He had been a man burdened by an unspeakable secret, living a double life. Jacob had been trying, in his own tormented way, to protect Elijah, to forge for him a normal life, a sanctuary from the curse that had befallen his true son, a life free from the dark, howling shadow that had consumed his own flesh and blood. Elijah wrestled with the agonizing question of his father's motives. He asked himself, was it truly an attempt to start anew, to forget the primal, bloody curse of his own lineage? A more cynical, chilling possibility gnawed at his gut, a terrible truth. Had Jacob used Elijah as a form of bait, a distraction, to draw the attention of the pack, to make them believe he was the sole heir of the hunter, thereby protecting his monstrous biological son? The thought was vile, repulsive, but it clung to him, adding a bitter, corrosive layer to Elijah's already shattered heart. It was a wound that cut deeper than any physical injury, a poison that seeped into his very soul. The implication of the photo, the words scrawled on its back, sent a fresh wave of terror through him. His brother, his blood brother, was already one of them. This was not merely a monster now. This was a being within the pack, a creature possessing a chillingly human intelligence, one who was aware of Jacob Woods and now, undeniably, aware of Elijah. The hunt, which had felt abstract and primal, now twisted into something far more insidious. It was no longer simply a matter of survival against an unknown foe. It was a desperate personal quest to unravel a horrific family secret, a confrontation with his own blood, a battle against a living, breathing part of his own dark lineage. A tempest of emotions raged within Elijah. Anger, hot and raw, at his father for having concealed such a devastating truth, for having thrust him unprepared and unknowingly into the maw of this ancient horror, and an icy, paralyzing fear of this unknown brother this monstrous reflection of his own blood. He knew he had to fight against something that was, by the cruelest twist of fate, part of his own family. He faced the terrible necessity of destroying a creature his father had once loved, had desperately tried to save, even if that love was now corrupted by fangs and claws. This dilemma, a profound soul-shredding moral quandary, tore at him from the inside, a battle waged not just in the shadows of the forest, but within the very core of his being. After this shocking discovery, Elijah's senses became painfully, unnaturally acute. He began to feel the presence of them around him with a physical intensity. The revelation opened up a new, terrifying channel of perception, a subconscious awareness, a primal, animalistic sense of their proximity. He felt their unseen movements in the rustle of leaves that was too deliberate, their hidden gazes in the sudden, unexplained chill that would ripple through his home. It was like a deer sensing the wolf, like a rabbit feeling the hawk, a terrifying, instinctual connection. His own blood, now awakened to its own terrible secret, felt the answering call of its monstrous kin, a sinister echo vibrating in his veins. In the deepest, most tormented corners of his soul, Elijah clung to a fragile, microscopic shred of hope. He held on to the understanding that he could understand something more, find a way to change the outcome, to somehow save his brother from the monstrous fate that had claimed him. But the crushing despair, the horrifying realization that his own blood relative was the very monster he now knew had killed his father, choked that nascent hope, leaving behind only the bitter metallic taste of grief and the chilling certainty of an inescapable, bloody destiny. The night was a long, suffocating shroud. Elijah did not sleep. He sat hunched in the oppressive darkness of his living room, the cold steel of his father's shotgun resting across his knees, his eyes fixed on the open journal and the faded photograph. Every shadow in the room, usually comforting in its familiarity, now writhed and shifted, coalesced into distorted, monstrous shapes. Every faint rustle or creak from outside the old farmhouse, amplified by the suffocating silence, sent a fresh wave of panic through him, making him flinch and clutch the shotgun tighter. Outside, the air grew thick and heavy, laden with an invisible, ominous weight. The wind, which had been a gentle whisper earlier, now whistled through the eaves, carrying on its breath a chorus of strange, unsettling sounds from the heart of the old whispering woods. The sharp, sudden crack of breaking branches, not from a storm, but from something moving with immense force. Distant, indistinct rasps and guttural growls that were swallowed immediately by the vastness of the night. The entire town, usually a bastion of quiet, predictable rhythms, felt frozen in a state of profound collective apprehension, a silent, anxious waiting for an unspoken dread to finally materialize. Just before dawn, as the first anemic rays of sun struggled to pierce through the persistent, low-hanging mist, Elijah, driven by an irresistible, morbid curiosity, slowly rose and walked to his front door. He pulled it open, his hand hovering over the cold metal. On the ground, directly on his worn welcome mat, barely a foot from his threshold, he saw them. Deep, fresh imprints of paws. They were unmistakable. The same impossible tracks he had seen at Farmer Horton's place. They were too large for any known wild animal, too deep, too defined, and imbued with that same horrifying, unmistakable hybrid quality. A monstrous fusion of beast and something sickeningly human. He stared at them, his breath catching in his throat. They had not just been in the woods. They had come to his house, right to his door, while he sat inside, shotgun in hand, convinced he was safe. The silent vigil he had felt, the unseen presence, had been chillingly physically real. The cold gray dawn, usually a harbinger of safety and respite, brought no comfort to Elijah. Instead, a fresh wave of horror washed over him. The pale, indifferent light merely illuminated the true, terrifying scale of his predicament, starkly confirming that the night's shadowy threats were not figments of a fevered imagination. They were concrete, undeniable, and had breached the last barrier of his perceived security. He felt the pressure building around him, a tangible, suffocating presence, as the very air itself thickened, becoming viscous and heavy. He understood now that this was no longer just a threat to his life, a simple matter of survival. This was something far, far greater. It was the continuation of an ancient battle, a generations-old war that had simmered beneath the surface of the quiet town. And now, whether he wanted it or not, he found himself standing squarely in the very center of its bloody, inexorable conflict. The psychological pressure had reached its apex, stretching Elijah's nerves to their breaking point. He felt himself teetering on the precipice of a nervous collapse, his mind a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. He constantly glanced over his shoulder, his senses hyper-alert, his hearing unnaturally sharp, every nerve ending screaming with an unbearable tension. His rational mind, the librarian's mind, desperately struggled to reject the impossible, to find a logical explanation for the unfolding nightmare. But his body, his every instinct, screamed a different truth, a brutal, undeniable reality that defied all reason. And then it came. From the lingering darkness that still clung stubbornly to the windows of his bedroom, a sharp, distinct tap. It was not the wind. It was not a branch. It was the unmistakable, chilling sound of claws. Not just one tap, but a series of them, rhythmic and deliberate, a soft, scraping sound against the glass. It was not a random occurrence, not an animal blundering into his house. This was a message, a warning. This was personal. And it was delivered by no mere beast. It was by something that knew him, that knew where he slept, that sought to make its presence intimately, undeniably known. The game, he realized, had just entered a terrifying new phase. The sharp, deliberate tapping of claws against his bedroom window pierced Elijah's very soul. His heart, already a frantic drum in his chest, seized, held in the icy grip of pure terror, before erupting into a frantic, hammering frenzy. Through the thin pane of glass, he caught a dull, momentary glint, the malevolent reflection of a pair of eyes burning in the pre-dawn gloom. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a lead weight in his gut, that this was no mere beast blindly seeking entry. This was something that knew exactly where he was, that sought his attention, that relished the psychological torment of its quarry. It wanted to play, a monstrous, sadistic game with his life as the stakes. As suddenly as it had begun, the tapping ceased. The silence that followed was even more profound, more chilling than before. But Elijah understood. This had not been an attempt to break in, to attack directly. This was a message. The first direct, undeniable interaction with them since he had dared to open his father's journal. And it was aimed precisely at him, a terrifying personal invitation to a game he could not refuse, a game whose rules were ancient and bloody. Slowly, his hands still trembling, Elijah closed his father's journal. He no longer needed its words. The truth, in all its horrifying, devastating glory, had been laid bare. All the questions that had tormented him had found their answers, but those answers had in turn unleashed an even greater multitude of problems that were no longer abstract or historical, but achingly, brutally personal. The story had moved beyond the yellowed pages. It had stepped into his living, breathing world. The hunt, he now understood with a chilling clarity, had irrevocably begun. But he had not been the one seeking answers, not truly. The answers had found him, had stalked him through the silent nights and the whispering woods, had clawed at his window until he was forced to acknowledge them. And he was not, as he had desperately hoped, the hunter. He was the victim, the unwitting heir to a bloody legacy. Or a new, terrifying thought began to take root in his mind. He had to become something else entirely. He had to become the predator. A bitter, unbearable irony mingled with the paralyzing horror. The most terrifying enemy, the ultimate shapeless evil, was not an unknown alien monster from the dark. It was a blood relative. A creature, his own brother, whom he should have loved, whom his father had desperately tried to save, yet who was now his primary threat, his personal curse, a grotesque mirror of his own lineage. The world had twisted into a cruel, macabre joke, and he was the unwilling punchline. Elijah understood, with a profound, aching certainty, that he had inherited from his father not just a journal filled with grim secrets and a cache of arcane weapons. He had inherited his father's endless war, his terrible curse, his profound tragedy. His life, the quiet, predictable life of a librarian in a forgotten town, had been irrevocably altered. There was no turning back now, no path to the comfort of the known. There was only the brutal, terrifying path forward, into the chilling unknown and into battle. And in the deepest, most primal core of his being, Elijah felt a strange, mystical pull. Not just the cold grip of fear, but a deeper, more profound, magnetic force, drawing him to the old whispering woods, to the heart of his brother-turned-monster's secret. It was a macabre, perverted curiosity, a desperate need for understanding that transcended mere terror. It was, he realized, the undeniable, terrifying call of blood, demanding answers, demanding vengeance, demanding a confrontation with the darkness that now flowed in his very veins. The game had truly begun, and Elijah Woods, heart-pounding, fists clenched, was now an unwilling player in a struggle as old as the woods themselves. Elijah stood at the window, the first tentative slivers of true dawn light painting the eastern sky in bruised purples and grays. He no longer saw the creatures, these shifting horrors, as simply wild, savage beasts. The journal, the photograph, the agonizing revelation of his brother's fate, all of it had transformed his understanding. Now, they were beings with a history, a terrifying lineage, a distorted intelligence, and yes, even their own profound, monstrous tragedy, especially his brother, the boy in the faded picture. Somewhere within that ravening beast, Elijah knew, there still flickered a tiny, tormented spark of humanity, a ghost of the child his father had loved. With a grim, terrible resolve, Elijah began to examine his father's weapons once more. The old rifles, their engravings now were less decorative and more like protective wards. The gleaming silver bullets, each one a promise of death. The cruel, curved daggers, their blades etched with the same ancient symbols that now felt like a second language to him. The small, stoppered vials of aconite, the wolfsbane, its dark liquid shimmering faintly in the dim light. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that he would have to learn quickly. His father's meticulously penned notes, his diagrams, his desperate observations. These were no longer a journal. They were a textbook, a brutal, comprehensive guide to survival in a world that had suddenly turned predatory. He became a student in a deadly school where every lesson carried the ultimate price. Elijah spread the journal across the worn kitchen table, the pages a roadmap of terror and strategy. He began to analyze his father's entries, searching for any detail, any overlooked observation that offered a tactical advantage, a way to survive, or even, impossibly, to win. He pored over the maps, tracing the green lines of escape routes, the red marks of attack, the ominous black circles of the lairs. He was no longer a passive reader, a horrified observer. He was now an active participant, a pupil in a brutal, unforgiving class where his own life hung in the balance, a desperate scholar of survival. But the most agonizing, soul-wrenching question remained, gnawing at him like a hungry thing in the dark. What about his brother? He grappled with the question of whether any humanity truly remained within that monstrous form. He faced the terrible choice. Could he, Elijah, somehow save him, reclaim even a fragment of the boy from the beast? Or would he be forced to do the unspeakable, to destroy his own blood? This question, a profound moral dilemma, haunted his every waking moment. Seeping into his thoughts, becoming the central, defining struggle he knew he would ultimately have to face, alone. He understood, with a clarity that both terrified and empowered him, that he was utterly, irrevocably alone in this. No one in the town, not a single soul, would ever believe his monstrous tale, not even when he shows them the journal, the weapons, the tracks in the mud. He would have to fight this war by himself, just as his father had. This thought, terrifying in its isolation, also ignited a cold, fierce spark of resolve deep within him, awakening a hidden potential, a steely courage he never knew he possessed. He was Jacob Woods' son, whether by blood or by fate, and the hunter's blood ran in his veins, ready or not. Elijah walked to the window, the faint light of the rising sun struggling to break through the perpetual gloom of the old whispering woods. He no longer feared to look into the impenetrable darkness because he knew with a chilling certainty that the darkness was looking back. His hands, no longer trembling, gripped the worn leather journal, not just as a relic of a tragic past, but as a shield and a sword, a tangible link to the knowledge he would need to survive. The journal was closed. The silent, terrifying story of Jacob Woods had reached its grim conclusion. But for Elijah Woods, his story, his personal, bloody war, was just beginning. He was ready for whatever the coming night would bring, ready for the inevitable clash with the monster that was his own blood, ready to embrace the terrible, glorious burden of his blood-soaked legacy. His father's war, a solitary, desperate struggle, was finally over. But the war of the son, Elijah Woods, had only just begun.